Another subject has to do with Aaron's use of Obeah, as it's called. It's spelled Obeah. Some people pronounce it Obeah, or some people pronounce it Obeah. They pronounced it Obeah. That harkens back in the book, in the very beginning of it, when I first met with him, to this very confusing conversation he put me through, where he kept asking me about books made in Chicago, and I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. And it wasn't until the second time I met him that he reached into his pocket and he took out this flyer with all of the Laurence products on it. This is an article from a Jamaican source called angel.com. She writes, the use of Laurence in Obeah was something that happened probably in the early 1900s and then flourished during the 1940s, around the Second World War. The popular belief seemed to have been that men acquired power from reading Laurence's books, more specifically the 6th and 7th books of Moses. And indeed, that was the book that Aaron was constantly trying to get me to get. It was considered to be the Bible by Laurence practitioners. The book allowed its readers to believe that they could take the powers of God unto themselves, which made them into very powerful men. They were then able to invoke spirits to fend off evil spirits and heal diseases, and she's leaving out here to do all kinds of bad stuff too. Otherwise thought to be, the disease otherwise thought to be incurable. Obeah was illegal in Jamaica. It was illegal as of as early as 1760, so during the slave era. This led to the British authorities implementing further legislation which banned the importing, publishing, selling, distributing, and reproducing of all Laurence publications relating to divination, magic, occultism, supernatural arts, or other esoteric subjects. That's taken right from his flyer, by the way, right? As they were classified as being, quote, instruments of Obeah, unquote. Aaron was the only guy I knew who was involved in this, along with his uncle, but I never saw his uncle with any books. Obeah never ended with this guy. It was a constant obsession of his. I don't think in the time I spent with him, more than maybe, if I met with him twice, I'd hear about it at least once on those two occasions. He did not think of it as something really external to really everyday affairs. He wrote me a number of letters over the period. I still have a bunch of them here. They're in his scrawl. Each one would have some sort of a request at the end of it for something to do with science, virtually all of them dealing with Laurence products. So he would ask me to please send him a fortune teller from Laurence. It costs $2, and that will be your gift, your birthday present to me. This I did keep from my time with him back in the day. This is recorded in the book as well, and this is when the book was seized in Montego Bay, that he had ordered, that this young hippie girl had sent to him from possibly the Boston area. I don't know where she was from originally. One book, the Book of Black Magic, and the other, the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The young lady, the hippie from the grill, who sent this book to him, obviously had hidden it, had hidden it under the rubric of 2 metal bookends. And as I wrote in the book, I told him, I said, man, I said, if this is the best you could do with a smuggler, I said, you're not going to be in good shape at all. Laurence was also, he sold everything. He sold books, he sold oils, incenses, lots of incenses. He sold amulets, he sold creams and powders, you name it, etc. But he also sold guard rings. Guard rings were used to guard off Obeah, to ward off Obeah. The most popular guard ring was, I call it the Zodiac ring, because it had this kind of star on it with all these Egyptian symbols stamped all over the damn thing, right? And people would wear them to protect themselves from people working science on them. When I went up to get that book for him at the post office in Montego Bay, there was this young man who was otherwise very well turned out. He had a nice crisp white shirt and tie, very well coiffed and everything. And I remember he had these nice steel glasses on too. And then when he went to get the package, he realized that the books had been seized. He came back and he was terribly nervous. And he kept fumbling, and he said that they'd been seized. And I said, well, why? What does that mean? So he pointed, and as he was doing so, I looked at his hand, right? And on his hand was none other than, that was probably his most popular guard ring. So what he did then was he turned the ring inward toward his palm, and anyway, made his good days to me. Aaron never wore a ring like that or bought rings like that. He made his own guards, and he was wearing one when I first met him, and that's recorded in the book. He also made several versions of that. Basically what it was about the size of a small tin of aspirin, about that big, and it was like a little piece of paper with red scribbles on it, and it was folded up very tightly, and then he would squeeze it between two clear pieces of plastic, and he had somehow some kind of plastic border. He was like a frame around it. I don't know how whether he bought that somewhere or he made it. I don't know how he did it. Then he glued the whole thing up, and he'd sell it to fishermen. They'd wear it to avert science at sea. Some of them used to nail it under the captain's seats of their boats, right? And he did a pretty good business with it. He'd sell them for about £2 a piece. That was a lot of money then. He wore his own version of that. Similarly, he departed from Laurence in terms of a main event in the book. That has to do with this piece of sculpture here, which is the Obeah doll that I described in the book. This has a bizarre background because, in terms of Obeah, because it came from a book that had nothing to do with Laurence. I don't know where he got the book from. All I know is that I saw it one day in his yard. He was going through it, and it was called something like, I think I called it in the book, A Pictorial History of Magic and Witchcraft. It was really a terrible, terrible book. It was just, it was awful, right? If I recall, there were actually some illustrations in it that were duplicated with different captions on them in the book, right? And they couldn't even get it together to do it even that right. The book included all kinds of photographs of everything from voodoo dolls, supposedly in Haiti, to African fetish type dolls. I've got some on the wall over here, actually. To masks, to the Salem witch trials. I mean, it was really quite encompassing. In terms of its subject matter. So I remember looking at it and saying to him, what is this, right? And he said, well, he thought it was great. He'd just gotten this thing and he was just trying to, get the hang of it. I do remember saying to him that, I mean, even Laurence's books were classier, right, than this piece of junk, right? Anyway, I never thought anything more about it until his yard was raided again by the police for the second or third time, whatever it was by then. And this time it was quite a serious raid. I mean, they had the superintendent from, called Docktown there. They had 2 Land Rovers full of cops, and they just tore the yard apart, and it was a bad scene. Took him off to jail, and I had to go to court afterwards. And that was the book that he was able to get back from the judge, because technically it wasn't a Laurence book. And so there was no specific prescriptions against it. To my astonishment, after the trial was over, the hearing is basically what it was, after the judge had decided to fine him $40 for the book, but let him go for the rest, he boldly walked up to the judge's bench, took his book back, and walked away. I was just astonished. The judge, I remember vividly, looked at me and shook his head, and I just pretended I didn't see him and just basically bolted out of there. But that he actually had the balls to take it back from the judge was after he just lectured him about Obeah was pretty incredible. Anyway, it was from that book that there was a doll in it, okay, and a picture of a doll. It was coincidentally enough, as I wrote in a footnote to the book, it was coincidentally enough, to the best of my knowledge, taken of a picture of a fetish doll in West Africa. And I happened to go to Paris not too many years ago with my wife. I went to a primitive art museum there in Paris, and I saw dolls very similar to this there. And not only that, but some of them were from Gabon, where I had done my Peace Corps tour in the 1960s. So it was pretty amazing to see this, right? And that's what he had copied. He saw a picture of one of these in that black book. So he built this thing. This was a reprisal against his neighbor, whom he claimed had been the one who had informed on him to the police about a small amount of ganja not long before, and that the police had gone right to that spot, and that he'd seen this guy watching him. He even told me that the man had been designs on his wife, and that's why he'd done it. He was trying to capture Pearl and take over Aaron's yard or house. He'd gone through great pains to make this, and he got the wood from the crown land there out of a big cedar tree, which he claimed it was a big block of wood like that, and that he carved it out of, and it was the heart of the cedar, which he said would make it very powerful because it could never rot unless you burned it. But then he always had a ready answer for that. He'd say, well, then you'd inhale the smoke, and that would kill you immediately. This is what he made, and I was there when he was actually driving the nails in it, as I described in the book, and I could not believe this, right? That he had pulled this thing out of that crazy book, and then he tied it to the fence between the post. It was a post between his yard and the neighbor's yard. It was following that the neighbor's son, about a week later, who was a captain of a Farsi boat, came to see me at Seaside, where I was doing some interviews of boat captains there, and he asked me to please come to his father's house with him, and the rest is in the book. It was the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen in my life. I mean, this guy was really sick unto death. I thought he was going to die right there. I went over to his yard after. I asked him, I told him what had happened, and that, enough was enough, and he'd made his point. We then got into a long dispute over it. His wife allied with me, and he ended up going off in a huff. He went up to the Crown Land for a couple of days, and she gave me an old sheet, and I ended up taking it back to New York, and I have it here. I have it here today. I failed to really get an understanding of what was going on in his mind. I guess that's the best way I could put it, okay? Because it all made sense to him, whether it was Obeah or his or Rastafarianism or his personal version thereof, okay, or politic and oppression, right? Or international affairs, right? Or cultivating ganja as a political statement, or etc., etc. I mean, it somehow all made sense to him. We were sitting there one evening, and he just harvested some kali, some really strong pot. So we were sitting there. He rolled up a spliff, and I rolled up one of my teeny-weeny spliffs, as he called them. And I had mine, and he had his. And anyway, it was very strong. Next thing I knew, I was sitting there, and I was just, talking to God kind of thing. And a very strong pot. So I wasn't really interviewing him at that point. I was just there, okay? And he decided to go on this this long rant about some national events in Jamaica, which he tied to to oppression and sufferation, which he tied to Rastafarianism and Jah God, which he tied in turn to, of all things, Obeah, right? Right? Which he then tied to whatever the hell it was. And I sat there absolutely kind of mesmerized, but I wasn't even listening to him. I wasn't able to, you know. And I had this kind of thing that went on in my head where I thought, geez, you know, if I could only turn into an ant now. I could turn into an ant. And we used to always sit on this long bench, right? Well, long, not that long, probably 8 feet long bench, right? That was nailed to a tree there. He'd sit on one side, I'd sit on the other side. And I could somehow turn into an ant. And I could crawl along the bench, right? And I could crawl up one of his arms, right? And I could crawl all the way across the shoulder there. And I could crawl up here and crawl inside one of his ears. And then get right inside his brain. Right? And I imagined it at the time as sort of like entering into like a planetarium or something. When I got inside, I'd see something like that. I'd see this incredible, whatever it would be in there, right? And I'd say, oh, that's how it works. But I never got to do that.